They say time is a river, but before the river ever flowed, before there was even a before, there was only one thing, pure existence. No planets, no people, no past, no future, just a still, endless now. And within that silence, there was order. Not the kind we understand, rules and laws and rulers, but a divine rhythm, a harmony so deep it held the fabric of all things. In this realm, everything just was. Perfect, unshaken, eternal. At the center of it all was a presence. Not a man in the sky, not a king on a throne, but a force, brighter than light, deeper than thought. Some called it the source, others simply God. And surrounding this source were countless beings, not made of flesh and blood, but of energy, consciousness, fire and sound and song. They weren't born, they were breathed into existence. Each one radiant, each one unique. They were the first creations, messengers, watchers, spirits of immense beauty and power. And they didn't just obey, they sang. Not words, but frequencies. Chords that kept the universe in balance. And above all others stood one, the brightest, the most gifted, the one who could reflect the light of the source more purely than any other. His name was Lucifer, not a monster, not yet. He was called the morning star because his light came first. Imagine a being so brilliant that even other divine beings looked at him with awe. He wasn't just powerful, he was loved, trusted, lifted high. Lucifer had a role, not just to shine, but to lead. He conducted the choirs of heaven. He kept the harmony of the divine realm. He was the bridge between the creator and creation. But here's the question. What happens when the brightest mirror starts seeing itself? At first, it was subtle, a thought, a flicker, not spoken aloud, not acted upon, just a pause. What if, he wondered, what if I'm not just a reflection, but a source myself? It didn't feel like pride, it felt like realization. He wasn't trying to overthrow, not yet. He just wanted to understand. But understanding can turn into yearning, and yearning can become hunger. He began to notice things, questions no one else was asking. Why was worship directed only to the source? Why was obedience praised, but curiosity restrained? Why were they created with choice, if they were never meant to choose? The others didn't question. They sang, they served, they trusted. But Lucifer watched. He studied the patterns. He read the frequencies behind the frequencies. And something changed. His music began to shift. A different tone entered the harmony, one that vibrated with independence. Not chaos, not rebellion, just a different note. And that note, soft at first, began to resonate. It was like a ripple in glass, subtle, silent, but growing. Not a storm, a whisper. But whispers in heaven are louder than screams on earth. And others began to hear it. Not all, but enough. They didn't see it as evil. They saw it as awakening. A call to something more. More than blind service. More than eternal sameness. Lucifer wasn't shouting. He was inviting. And in that invitation, the first fracture appeared. Not in the realm, but in loyalty. Because even in paradise, choice exists. And where choice exists, so does division. Some stood firm, unmoved, anchored in the source. But others leaned closer, curious, moved by Lucifer's light, by the freedom it promised. And in that moment, the kingdom before time was no longer unified. It was trembling. But here's where it gets strange. If the source knew everything, every thought, every possibility, why allow this to unfold? Why breathe life into a being capable of turning? Unless this wasn't a mistake. Unless this fracture, this rebellion was not a flaw, but a test, a catalyst, a mirror to reflect back the deepest truths of creation. Because love that cannot choose isn't it love? And loyalty that cannot stray isn't loyalty. So perhaps the kingdom before time had to break. Not because the light failed, but because it needed to expand. And that expansion would begin with a fall. Before there was earth, before sun and stars and dust, Before history began, before time was even born, there was order. Not the kind we know, rules, governments, armies, but something much deeper, a living order, a breathing structure, no chaos, no decay, no death, no doubt, just an unshakable rhythm that held everything in place. And in the center of that rhythm was a throne. But it wasn't made of stone. It wasn't decorated with jewels. This throne was made of will, pure, eternal, indestructible will. It didn't sit in a room. It wasn't surrounded by columns or guards. It existed in a realm where matter didn't matter, where thoughts shaped reality, where energy was the language, and consciousness was the air. In this place, outside of time, beyond space, everything was alive, even the silence. Countless beings moved through this realm, not born, not raised. They were spoken into being, each one unique, each one glowing. We might call them angels, but those who witnessed them firsthand used older names. Watchers, flames, sons of the dawn. Some were small, messengers, whisperers of light. Some were massive, beings of thunder and flame, able to carry galaxies in their breath. They did not age. They did not sleep. They existed to reflect, to create, to maintain the balance of all things. They were not robots. They had awareness. They had identity. And above all, they had one gift: choice. Even in perfection, they could choose. At the highest place among these beings stood a circle of power, the firstborn, the most trusted, the archangels. And at the very top of that circle was one. His name, Lucifer. It means light bringer. He wasn't the villain in this moment. He wasn't fallen. He was the most beautiful, the most radiant, the most adored. Lucifer didn't rule the kingdom, but he stood closest to the throne. Like the conductor of a divine orchestra, he carried the melody of creation itself. Through him, the will of the source moved like music. He didn't just follow orders. He sang them into being. And when he sang, everything moved, stars aligned, dimensions harmonized, whole realities danced. In this realm, nothing was hidden. Everything flowed like light. Every being knew its purpose. Every song had its place. It was perfect, or so it seemed, because something strange happens, or when perfection exists for too long, it stops evolving, it becomes still. And even in a kingdom without shadows, something stirred, not loud, not violent, just a feeling, like the tiniest vibration in a crystal, a ripple too soft to notice at first. But it was there, something ancient, older than time, quieter than thought, a whisper of separation. Where did it come from? Was it planted? Did it arise naturally? We don't know. But here's what we do know. Lucifer began to change. Not suddenly, not with rage, but with awareness. He started to look inward, not out of pride, but out of curiosity. He began to ask questions no one else dared to ask. Why? Why should everything stay the same forever? Why should harmony mean silence? Why shouldn't a being so bright shine for itself? At first the thoughts were soft, passing clouds. But thoughts are seeds, and seeds, when watered by attention, begin to grow. Lucifer wasn't angry. He was wondering, what is this throne? What lies beyond it? Why can't I see the full picture? And most dangerously, what if I am meant to shape it? It wasn't rebellion, not yet. It was exploration, the earliest sparks of identity. Lucifer wasn't trying to destroy, he was trying to understand. But in a realm of perfect symmetry, a single shift can feel like an earthquake. The other beings noticed. They felt it in his song. The melodies became more complex. The harmony turned unpredictable. It wasn't dissonance, it was freedom. But freedom in a realm built on alignment can feel like a threat. And so the first question was born, not in Lucifer's mind, but in everyone else's. What is he becoming? Was this an evolution or the start of a fall? Even the throne, unmoved as it was, seemed to listen. The source didn't strike him down, didn't silence his song, because this kingdom wasn't built on force, it was built on will. And will must always allow choice, even when that choice threatens everything. Lucifer still stood in the light, still held his place, but within him a new awareness grew. Not evil, not dark, just different. And that difference was enough, because now there were two melodies, one of eternal alignment and one of something new. Not destruction, not chaos, just possibility. So what is perfection really? Is it stillness or is it growth? And if heaven is truly perfect, must it allow the risk of falling? Because without the option to turn away, is there even such a thing as devotion? These were the questions Lucifer never voiced aloud. He didn't need to. They pulsed through the air. They echoed through the realm. They were felt. And in the silence that followed, a quiet divide opened. Not in space, but in spirit. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't betrayal. Not yet. But something had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. They called him the morning star, not because he rose early, but because his light came first, before time ticked its first second, before earth turned beneath a sun, before the idea of evil was even born. Lucifer stood, glowing brighter than all the rest. He wasn't a shadow. He wasn't a serpent. He wasn't twisted or scarred or dark. He was perfect, a being crafted with beauty so complete that other angels paused when he passed. His voice like rivers of music, his presence like standing near the sun, but feeling comfort, not pain. Lucifer wasn't just powerful, he was trusted. He stood nearest to the throne. He moved through realms few others could enter. He didn't beg for glory, he was glory. But here's the question no one dares ask. Can perfection become a prison? Lucifer didn't fall overnight. There was no single moment where light turned to dark. It happened slowly, like morning turning to dusk. At first it was just awareness. He looked around and saw his own reflection, not in mirrors but in the reactions of others. How they admired him, how they followed him, how they waited for his voice to begin the song. He began to notice that when he moved, reality responded. When he spoke, creation echoed. And for the first time he began to wonder, what am I? Not who, but what? Was he just a servant, or was he something more? Was he a messenger of power, or a source of it? That question, it didn't come with fire. It came with silence. A deep, vibrating silence that filled the space between thoughts. And once that silence entered him, he could not unhear it. Lucifer began to see himself, and what he saw was potential, not pride, not yet. Just a simple, terrifying realization. He was powerful, not by accident, not by mistake, but by design. Why give a being this much light if he was never meant to shine on his own? Why give him awareness if awareness was dangerous? And most of all, why should all glory return to the throne when the light clearly flowed through him? He began to imagine a different kind of order, one not ruled from above, but shared between the luminous. What if creation didn't need a king? What if it needed a chorus? And what if he could lead it? These weren't evil thoughts. They were questions. Questions no one else dared to ask. But questions are seeds. And seeds, when left in the dark, don't die. They root. Lucifer began to speak in tones that felt different. Not darker, just deeper. More layered. He questioned without confronting. He wondered aloud and others listened. Some were afraid, but others were drawn in. Because deep down, many of them had felt it too. That quiet sense that something was missing, that there could be more. Lucifer wasn't starting a rebellion, he was starting a conversation. But in heaven, even a conversation can tear a hole in eternity. The moment things truly changed was the moment Lucifer stopped asking and started believing. He began to accept that the light within him wasn't just a gift, it was a calling, a sign. He wasn't a reflection, he was a source. That thought didn't just lift him, it consumed him. What if the throne wasn't the end? What if the one who sat upon it was simply the beginning, and he was the next step? Not opposition, evolution, not disobedience, Ascension. What if Lucifer wasn't falling, but rising? The idea became fire. It burned in his being. He didn't whisper his thoughts anymore. He sang them. And his song, it wasn't like the others. It carried power, gravity, a pull. The heavens, once held in perfect harmony, began to bend around his melody. Some resisted, some recoiled, but others, many others, listened. And they didn't hear rebellion. They heard hope, hope for a new order, hope for freedom, hope for meaning beyond obedience. Lucifer didn't promise chaos, he promised choice. And when you've never tasted it before, choice is intoxicating. But the moment Lucifer's song rose louder than the ancient rhythm of the throne, the cosmos shivered. It wasn't a clash, not yet, but it was a warning. Because two songs cannot rule the same silence. Two lights cannot guide the same path. And so the question echoed through eternity. Was Lucifer becoming evil? Or was he revealing something that had always been true? That light, when reflected long enough, starts to believe it originates from within. That awareness, when focused too tightly on the self, becomes a mirror too bright to see beyond. Lucifer still stood in light. But that light had changed. It was no longer given. It was claimed. He was no longer the morning star. He was a rising sun, one that refused to set. He didn't march. He didn't rage. He sang. And the echoes of that song began to pull the heavens apart. Because some began to wonder, was this the beginning of a fall or the start of something divine? It wasn't a war of swords. There were no clashing armies, no thunder of marching feet, no blood spilled on burning ground. This war was different. It didn't explode into existence. It whispered itself into being, a silent crack in what once seemed unbreakable. A war, not of weapons but of will. It began in stillness, a pause, a breath held across eternity. And then, light turned against light. Glory rose against glory. Brothers once inseparable now stood on opposite sides of a line that had never existed before. A line drawn not with force, but with choice. Lucifer no longer sang in harmony. His voice was still beautiful, still powerful, but it carried a different rhythm now. One that didn't blend, it challenged. And the moment that new melody grew louder, everything changed. He wasn't alone. Others had heard his song, not just a few, not just outliers, but many. Beings of brilliance, once woven into the same divine fabric, now pulled by a new thread. A third of heaven, not rebels, not monsters, but beings of light, just like him, just like the others. They didn't rise with anger, they rose with belief. Belief that maybe this new vision of order was the next evolution. That maybe it was time for something different. Heaven had never known division. The idea of disagreement was alien. There was no word for conflict, no space for resistance, until now. The ones who remained loyal, they didn't understand what was happening. Not fully. They only felt the fracture, like a beautiful song suddenly turning sour, like a perfect mirror cracking from the center. They watched their brothers drift away, not with fists raised, but with eyes that burned with something new. Not hatred, not defiance, but certainty. That they were doing what was right, that they were choosing truth. And that's the deepest wound of all, isn't it? Not when enemies fight, but when those you love truly believe you are wrong, and worse, when they believe you're the one who has fallen. The divide wasn't just between beings, it was between realities. Two visions of what heaven should be. One held to the eternal order, unchanging, flawless, obedient. The other longed for something else, freedom, expression, a kingdom where the throne did not stand above, but among. And here's the part that still echoes through time. No one stopped it. The source, the one at the center of all light, did not strike Lucifer down. No fire fell, no punishment reigned. The Creator simply watched. Why? If God is all-knowing, if every heartbeat and thought is visible, then why let it begin? Why not prevent the fracture before it spread? Was it mercy? Was it love? Or was it something else? A test? A necessary turning? Was the war in heaven not an accident, but a design? Because think about it. If everyone serves because they must, then what is devotion? If no one can choose to walk away, then what does loyalty even mean? Maybe this war was the cost of something far more precious. True choice. The kind that risks everything. The kind that breaks things wide open. The kind that separates appearance from truth. Because only in the face of freedom can love prove itself real. And only in the presence of rebellion can loyalty be chosen, not imposed. So the war broke out, but not with battles. Not yet. It was a storm of wills, a tearing of light from light, a divine earthquake felt in realms beyond time. And when the final notes of Lucifer's song rose, when he stood tall in defiance, the line was finally fully drawn. There would be no going back. The kingdom before time was no longer won. Now comes the part too many forget. The ones who followed Lucifer, they didn't think they were evil. They believed they were right. They saw the old order as limiting. They believed the source had withheld something. That power should be shared, not guarded. That worship should be mutual, not one way. Lucifer didn't tell them to hate. He told them to see, to open their eyes, to embrace their light, to become gods themselves. And so they followed, not into darkness, but into a different kind of light. One that promised freedom, but delivered exile. Because choice has consequences, and heaven could no longer contain two songs. So it happened. The fall, not a stumble, not a mistake, a separation. The divine realm expelled what could no longer remain, not with cruelty, but with necessity. Because two visions cannot share one throne. Two kings cannot rule one crown. Lucifer and his followers were cast out, not destroyed, not erased, but removed. From the center to the edges, from the light to the shadow. Not because they were hated, but because they chose a different way. And here's the haunting part. What if that war never truly ended? What if it's still happening now? Not in heaven, but in hearts. What if every time we face a decision, a test of loyalty, a whisper of rebellion, we are replaying that moment? Because the great divide wasn't just cosmic, it was personal. It was about what kind of world we want, what kind of light we follow, what kind of freedom we believe in. And maybe, just maybe, this war was never about heaven alone. Maybe it was always meant to reach us. They were cast out, but the heavens didn't scream. There was no explosion, no sky torn apart, no great roar announcing their fall. Just silence, a silence so vast it echoed louder than thunder. Lucifer and those who followed him, a third of all the divine host, were removed from the harmony they once sang in. But here's the question that echoes across every age. Where did they go? Was there a place ready to receive them? A prison prepared? Or did they fall into nothing? Into the void? Imagine it. Beings made of light, of frequency, of power, thrown from a realm beyond space into a realm that wasn't ready for them. No throne, no order, no center, just dislocation. Did they fall straight into darkness? Or did the fall create the darkness itself? And even more haunting, what happens to light that has been torn from its source? Does it fade? Does it twist? Or does it adapt? Some say they landed in the abyss, a space without shape, a realm outside the known. What the ancients called the deep, a place of unformed chaos. Others whisper that they came here, to earth, not as demons in the shadows, not with horns or wings, but through whispers, through ideas, through systems. Not as beasts, but as influencers. Because what if the fall wasn't just a descent, but a strategy? What if, cast from heaven, they decided to reshape the battlefield? Not to wage war from above, but from within. Not to destroy cities, but to guide them. Not to silence humans, but to inspire them. But not toward truth, toward control, subtle, slow, invisible, You see, darkness rarely arrives in full. It comes in layers, in suggestions, in slight shifts of meaning. A voice that says, "Is this really wrong? Isn't this power yours to claim? Why obey when you can lead?" And here's the chilling part. They don't need to possess us. They only need to plant the seed. So, where did they go? They went into kingdoms, into gold and empire, into law twisted by greed and power divorced from compassion. They went into whispers behind thrones, into contracts written in blood, into wars started with lies. And still, they speak, not through howls or curses, but through influence, through systems that reward the ruthless, through cultures that celebrate the self but punish the soul, through desires that never rest, through screens and policies and empty promises. Maybe the fallen never needed to take our hands. They only needed to touch our thoughts, to bend them, to twist them just slightly, enough to make us doubt the light, enough to make us believe that truth is just another tool. That power is what defines goodness, that the loudest voice is the one we should follow. Sound familiar? And yet, here's where the mystery deepens. If these beings truly fell, why are they still allowed to move? Why not stop them completely? Why not lock them away forever? Unless their presence here serves a greater purpose. What if Earth wasn't just a battleground, but a test ground? A place where free will is not only allowed, but required. Where light and shadow move through the same streets, and we are asked every day, which one will we choose? Because maybe the war in heaven didn't end. Maybe it simply changed locations, from the skies into the soul, from celestial temples to our ordinary days. What if every decision we make, to speak or to stay silent, to love or to take, to serve or to rule, is a continuation of that ancient split? Not just between angels, but between ways of being. So where did they go? The fallen? They walk through history. They whisper in ambition. They linger in pride. They echo in every moment where power is placed above purpose. But they also expose something else. They show us that we are not puppets, that even in a world filled with shadows, we hold a light that cannot be taken, only surrendered. And that is why their war continues, because their defeat is not decided by force. It's decided by choice. Yours, mine, everyone's. So the next time you feel torn between silence and courage, between truth and convenience, between rising and staying still, just remember, you may be standing in the middle of a war that began before the world was born, and you're not just part of the story, you are the battlefield. There are stories that were never meant to be read, books that were written, then buried, chapters spoken, then silenced. Not because they were false, but because they were dangerous. Not to the soul, but to the system. You see, when the war in heaven ended, or appeared to, something was left behind, not weapons, not scars, but records. Witnesses wrote what they saw. Scrolls were filled with things too great for human minds to fully grasp, too divine, too terrifying, too true. And yet, they survived. Whispers of them, at least, names you won't hear on Sunday mornings. The Book of Enoch, the Apocalypse of Abraham, the Testament of Reuben, the Book of Jubilees, the Secrets of the Watchers. These were once considered sacred. Now they're called heresy. But ask yourself, who decided that? And what were they so desperate to hide? Let's begin with the Book of Enoch. It tells of beings who descended from the sky, not spirits, not myths, but real sentient watchers. They didn't fall to destroy, they fell to teach. But what they taught wasn't always meant for us. They gave knowledge, secret knowledge, about stars, about time, about the movement of heaven, and more than that, they taught about power, about metal, weapons, war, and they didn't come alone. They took human women. They birthed children, giants, half human, half something else, not a fairy tale. A warning, because these hybrids, called Nephilim, disrupted the balance of the world. They consumed too much, took too much, became too much, until creation itself begged for cleansing. And what followed was a flood. That story isn't in your regular Bible, at least not like that, but it once was before it was stripped away, filed under myth, labeled as non-canon. But who made that decision? And more importantly, why? Then there's the Testament of Reuben, a strange ancient document that speaks of a war behind the veil. It describes spirits that whisper into bloodlines, into minds, into generations. It warns that some struggles don't come from earth, but from elsewhere. That temptation isn't always ours. That sometimes darkness has a face you can't see. That some battles we fight began before we were born. The Testament tells us not to fear punishment, but to fear forgetting. Because forgetting the war means losing it. And then comes the apocalypse of Abraham, a vision so vivid, so haunting, that those in power feared it would wake too many people up. It shows a layered heaven, not one level, but many, and on each level, forces fight for dominion. Abraham has shown not just the creation of man, but the construction of deception. He sees an idol, serpent-shaped, worshipped unknowingly by humanity, not as evil, but as God. Think about that. The very thing people believe gives them light might actually be hiding them from it. This text tells us that true evil doesn't arrive in shadows. It arrives dressed in light, in robes, in temples, in doctrines. And that's why it was hidden, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. So again, we must ask, why were these books removed? What were early religious leaders so afraid of? Were they trying to protect us or protect power? Because if these texts had remained, the official story would collapse. The neat line between good and evil, blurred. The single fall of Lucifer, revealed as just the beginning, a beginning of infiltration, of watchers walking among us, of knowledge given before its time, of ancient covenants, broken and reformed behind closed doors, and perhaps a test, a cosmic test we're still taking. What if the true goal of the fallen wasn't to destroy us? What if it was to make us forget? Forget that we were once connected. Forget that we were born with light. Forget that the war in heaven didn't end in the clouds. It descended into us, and now we carry it in our thoughts, in our choices, in the voices we follow when no one's watching. Some say the forbidden books were too much for early minds, too complex, too mystical. Others say they revealed too many uncomfortable truths, that divinity isn't as far away as we were told, that angels have fallen, but not all are gone, that heaven isn't above us, it's within reach. And maybe, so is hell. Not as fire, but as forgetting. We like clean stories. One villain, one hero, one book, one truth. But what if reality is deeper? What if the war in heaven didn't create two sides, but opened a doorway? A crack in the wall, and through that crack, truth leaked out into old books, into ancient warnings, into forbidden knowledge. The kind you don't read with your eyes, but feel in your bones. So now we're left with a choice: to keep following the safe story, the edited version, the polished myth, or to step into the unknown, to open the pages they buried, and ask the hardest question of all: what else have we forgotten? Because if the fall wasn't the end, but the beginning, then the real story of heaven is still unfolding. Some truths were never meant to be forgotten. Some books were never meant to be buried. And some stories were erased not because they were false, but because they revealed too much. Long ago, after the fall, after the war in heaven split the skies and shattered the silence, a record remained, not of blood and battles, but of secrets. Secrets written in ink, in visions, in dreams. But those records didn't survive untouched. They were removed, hidden, labeled dangerous, pushed outside the walls of religion, outside the comfort of doctrine. And yet they remain. Whispers, fragments, forgotten gospels, the Book of Enoch, once read by prophets, now locked away in dusty libraries. It tells a story we're rarely allowed to hear, of angels who came down not to destroy, but to teach. They taught humans how to read the stars, how to use roots and fire, how to shape metal into weapons. And they didn't come empty-handed. They came with desire. They took human women. They created something new. The Nephilim, giants with hunger too great for the earth to hold, and when their presence twisted creation, the flood came, not just to cleanse the world, but to reset the balance. Why was this story removed? What does it change? Then there's the Apocalypse of Abraham, a book of visions so strange, so piercing, it was considered too dangerous to read aloud. It tells of layered heavens, realms upon realms, and a serpent not crawling through gardens, but standing tall on a throne of deception. Abraham sees a world where good and evil don't wear labels, where the false can wear robes, where the light we follow might actually be hiding the truth. That vision didn't sit well with the keepers of tradition. So the book was buried, not because it lied, but because it asked the wrong questions. And then there's the Book of Jubilees. It offers a different timeline, one that rewrites the history we've come to believe. One where angels guide human destiny, and sin is not just an act, but a system. It tells us that the Watchers didn't just fall, they interfered, and that their interference continues. So ask yourself this: why were these texts removed? Why were these voices silenced? Was it to protect us or to protect power? What if these forbidden books reveal the very thing the fallen don't want us to know? That the war in heaven didn't end, it simply changed battlegrounds. And we are now the battlefield. Because knowledge is power, and forbidden knowledge is the kind that breaks illusions. It doesn't tell you what to believe. It shows you what was left out. And once you see it, you can never look at the world the same way again. If you're still listening, if this story has stirred something inside you, then this channel is for you. We bring the lost, the hidden, and the forbidden back into light. So if you want to keep uncovering the truths they tried to bury, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what they don't want you to find. The next chapter is waiting.